The picture was taken in a quiet, rural part of Pennsylvania on a fall afternoon. At first, it didn't look like anything strange. There was a small wooden house behind two young women who were standing next to each other in front of the camera. Their dresses were simple. They stood up straight, and their faces were calm, but not too much. Their faces didn't show any signs of distress. There was no sense of urgency and no clear reason to worry. But this picture would later be the only record of a life that was mostly lived in secret. The house was in Clearfield County, which is far from the busier roads that connect cities to towns. People who lived nearby knew the property well enough to point it out, but not well enough to talk about it with confidence. They knew that two sisters lived there. They knew that their mother had lived there before them. After that, the details faded into vague memories. The family stayed to themselves. They didn't make any trouble. They paid for things like food and cash when they needed to. They didn't go to church every week. They didn't have guests over. For many years. This lack of presence didn't seem like a big deal. No one, at least not out loud, questioned the fact that the sisters were almost never seen outside of their land. The seasons changed. The town grew slowly but noticeably. Kids went to work somewhere else. Radios brought voices from far away, but the sisters stayed where they had always been. This story isn't about violence. It's not about being mean in the obvious way. It's about something that is quieter and harder to see in many ways. It is how fear can be passed down without words. It is about how safety can turn into prison. And it's about what happens when freedom comes, but you can't use it anymore. If you care about stories that bring to light forgotten lives and look at the hidden effects of being alone, please think about subscribing and leaving a comment. These stories will only live on if people remember them. The sisters were born in the early 1900s, the same house where they would later live for most of their lives. Their father died when they were still very young, so their mother had to raise them by herself on a piece of land she rarely left. Neighbors remembered her as shy and careful, someone who didn't like to talk for long periods of time and ended conversations quickly. She wasn't mean, but she was distant, as if the world outside her property line required a level of trust she no longer had. From the start, the world of the children was carefully narrowed down. They didn't go to school. Their mother taught them useful skills instead of abstract ideas, which is how they learned. There wasn't much reading, there wasn't much writing. They only used numbers to count supplies. The girls learned how to cook, clean, take care of the garden, and store food for the winter. Their days had a set pattern that didn't change very often. People inside the house didn't talk about rules like they were orders. They were sent as warnings. It was dangerous outside the land. People couldn't be. Believed. Roads took people to places where danger was hidden. The mother didn't make these claims sound worse than they were. She said them as if they were facts, like talking about the weather or how time goes by. The sisters didn't question these explanations when they were kids. They didn't have a way to doubt. The land gave them everything they needed. The house felt safe. Their mom was sure. People who don't know anything else may find comfort in certainty, even when it is small. The sisters were old enough to see the edges of. In their world, those edges already felt like they couldn't be moved. They sometimes saw cars or wagons go by on the road in the distance. The sounds were strange, but they didn't sound good. Their mother would close the curtains and tell them to focus on their chores. When curiosity came up, it was quietly discouraged. Answers to questions were short or not at all. The sisters learned not to ask. Years went by like this, not by calendars, but by harvests and winters. The house stayed the same. The land was still enough. The mother stayed, watchful, and the girls grew into young women without ever crossing the line that had defined their lives. No one stepped in because nothing seemed obviously wrong. To the outside world, This was just a family living their lives in peace. The sisters only knew this way of life, and to their mother it was a way to keep danger away for good. No one could see how deeply that system would affect what happened next. The certainty that ruled thee. It wasn't by chance that Sister's childhood happened. Their mother shaped it on purpose every day, and her fears were not sudden or unreasonable in her own mind. She had grown up during a time when the economy was unstable, people were sick, and people died. And those things made her very wary of anything she couldn't directly control. After her husband died, that distrust turned into a guiding principle. She thought that the outside world asked too much of people who entered it. It thought flexibility, negotiation, and resilience. She didn't think her daughters could safely develop these traits without hurting themselves. She thought that safety shouldn't be put to the test. It was something that needed to be kept by not doing it. There were never any written rules for the house. They were part of everyday life and were made stronger by doing them over and over. The doors stayed closed except when they really needed to be opened. Only enough windows were opened to let air flow. Visitors were discouraged not by hostility, but by silence. When neighbors tried to talk to her, the mother kept her answers short and to the point, making sure that no relationship went beyond simple recognition. Inside the house, exploration was replaced by predictability. Every day, meals were served at the same times. There was a set order for tasks. When deviations happened, they were fixed right away. The sisters didn't get in trouble in the usual way. Instead, they were reminded of what would happen if they went past the fence line. Sickness, exploitation, and loss. These words were said in a calm way, but they were serious enough to stick with them. As the sisters got older, they started to see that other kids didn't live the same way they did. Sometimes, laughter from far away could be heard across the fields. They could hear music from a radio that was driving by sometimes. These sounds made me briefly curious, but I didn't know where to put my curiosity. The mother said things like that were distractions that could lead to disappointment or danger. She talked a lot about how fragile life is and how quickly it can end. Be harmed by things we don't understand. There was nothing dramatic about her tone. It taught something. The world wasn't shown to be cruel, but careless, and she thought that in a careless world, retreat was the only sure way to protect herself. The sisters took these ideas to heart, slowly taking them in without any trouble. They trusted their mother because she was the only person who had ever told them the truth about the world. Even though her warnings limited movement and thought, they felt like they were protecting her. Over time, the difference between advice and orders faded. By the end of the 1920s, the lines between home and work were both physical and mental. The sisters didn't need to be reminded to stay on the land anymore. They stopped asking about the road. They no longer thought about the lives they could have outside of their daily routines. The rules had changed from being enforced by others to being expected by oneself. The mother didn't talk about the future very often. She only talked about marriage, work, and school when it was necessary to keep the house running. Her main concern stayed focused on preservation. Every day that went by without any problems was seen as a success. She thought she had done something amazing. She had made it so that there was less uncertainty and no risk at all. She didn't think about how much it would cost to leave her daughter out, or how much it would affect her ability to function outside of that environment. The sisters, on the other hand, did not feel like they were missing out. They didn't know what they were missing. Their world was. It was small, but it was always there, and years of consistency can make it feel like security. As the decade went on, the rules that used to need an explanation started to work on their own. Instruction was replaced by silence. Habit took the place of warning. It looked like the house was part of the system, The walls made it seem like everything needed was inside them. At the end of this time, the sisters were no longer just following their mother's rules. They were living inside her fears and carrying them with them. Forward without a doubt, not knowing that these fears would soon have to deal with their first big problem. As the sisters grew up from early childhood to their teenage years, the boundaries of their world became clearer, even though their understanding of it stayed limited. The land around the house gave their day structure. In the morning, they took care of the garden and the few animals that lived on the property. In the afternoon, people cooked and cleaned. The evening became quiet, with only the sounds of wind or bugs outside the walls. There was no feeling of moving forward after these tasks. Every day was the same as the day before, and every season seemed to follow a pattern that would never change. The sisters learned by watching and doing things over and over again, instead of through school or talking to other kids. They imitated how their mother moved, how she spoke, and how careful she was. Mistakes were gently but firmly fixed, which made it clear that going off course was not only unnecessary but also dangerous. They learned to do this over time. Expect correction before it came. The language used in the home stayed useful and polite. People talked about what they needed right now and what they had to do. Questions that weren't clear went away just as quickly as they came. The sisters learned that staying quiet was often the best way to get through the day without any problems. As their bodies changed, they became more aware of how different they were from others. They understood that they were no longer kids, but nothing around them acknowledged this. Change. There were no ceremonies, no talks about becoming an adult, and no expectations other than to keep obeying and helping out around the house. People didn't notice that growth was happening. There were times when moments of curiosity came up out of nowhere, like a person walking by on the road or a sound in the distance that made me think of a gathering or celebration. These moments caused a short-lived feeling of tension inside, as if there was something they didn't understand. But that tension quickly went away when there was no language or reference. It was replaced by the comfort of knowing. The sisters needed each other more and more to find their way. Having the same routines brought them closer together, but it also made their bond smaller. They became mirrors, showing each other the same behaviors and ideas over and over. It was hard to tell what people wanted, because choice didn't mean much in such a small frame. Their mother liked how close they were. For her, it proved that the system she had built was stable. The girls did not cross any lines. They didn't say they are unhappy. They looked happy. What they couldn't see was how the lack of exposure had started to change their inner world. Without practice in making decisions, not knowing what to do became too much to handle. Not talking to anyone made me feel like I was in danger. The thought of leaving the land no longer seemed like a real option, but rather an unknown risk that should be avoided at all costs. By the early 1930s, the sisters were old enough that most people their age were starting to form their own identities apart from their families. Instead, their identities were always tied to the daily routines that ran their lives. The house was not a context in their mother's rules. They were the bases. The sisters no longer needed to enforce the rules that used to be in place. They didn't need to be told to stay close or be quiet anymore. These actions had become automatic responses instead of conscious choices. What had started as protection had turned into a habit, and habit lasts long enough to become not different from need. The sisters stayed stuck in a childhood that never really ended, even though the outside world kept changing in ways they couldn't see. They didn't know that this long period of stillness would soon be tested by forces beyond their control. The moment that changed the balance of the house came out of the blue and without any planning. It happened on a summer afternoon when the air was thick and the work in the garden was done earlier than usual. The sisters were walking close to the far edge of the property, which they didn't go to very often but weren't told they couldn't go to. From there, the road started to show up. They didn't get on it. They didn't even get to the fence that marked the end of the property. They just stood there and watched as a small line of cars went by, kicking up dust that stayed in the air for a short time. The noise was strange, but it wasn't scary. It gave off a sense of movement that was very different from how still their own lives were. The sisters saw people who didn't belong to their group for the first time. Their daily lives. Their clothes looked different. Their posture showed that they were doing something on purpose, not just repeating it. One of the women in the car that passed by laughed, and the sound cut through the quiet in a way that the sisters had never heard before. They didn't talk to each other, they didn't wave, they didn't follow. They only watched until they couldn't see the cars anymore. That short exposure made them feel something they couldn't put into words. It wasn't want or rebellion, it was more like being lost. The certainty that had. Their understanding of the world felt a little shaky for a moment, as if a layer of assumption had been quietly lifted. They went back to the house without talking about it, not knowing that their mother had already seen that they were gone. She reacted right away and made a decision. She didn't yell, but her tone made it clear that there was no room for negotiation. She asked them a lot of questions, not to get information, but to make sure they knew where the lines were. She said again that the road was not just dangerous. It was hard to guess. It took people to places where they disappeared or came back, changed in ways that couldn't be undone. That night, the rules got stricter. The curtains stayed closed for longer. The sisters were given new tasks so they would stay closer to the house. Even though the property lines hadn't changed, the edges were verbally redefined. The mother didn't say they had done anything wrong, but she was much more watchful. The sisters felt a change in the days that followed, but they couldn't put it into words. The home looked smaller. Silence meant more. The routines went on, but the ease that came with them was replaced by a quiet tension. The memory of the road didn't go away, but it wasn't interesting anymore. It became linked to pain and anxiety. The sisters quickly realized that thinking about it made them feel conflicted inside, and there was no way to fix it. Their mother saw the event as proof of her fears. The outside world had shown itself. Too soon, too clearly. She thought that containment was no longer enough. Control needed to be strengthened. What she didn't see was how that one look had made her aware of something. The sisters now understood that their world was not whole. They didn't know what was on the other side, but they knew that something was there. This awareness didn't open a door. It made it close more tightly. The sisters didn't want to talk to each other again. They went back to their old routines, which had always governed them, using what they knew to bring back a sense of balance. The memory faded into the background of everyday life over time, but it still had an effect. The house was no longer just a safe place. It had become a line that people kept on purpose. The mother made sure that the outside world stayed abstract and scary by responding to curiosity with restriction. The sisters learned that even a brief exposure could have consequences by accepting that response. This was the last time they would see the road, without being afraid. From then on, being alone was no longer just a part of their lives. It became an expectation, reinforced by caution and silence, that leaving would be hard and maybe even impossible in the future. When the sisters became adults, they were no longer forced to be alone. It had become the way they made sense of life itself. The routines that used to shape their childhood now shaped their whole sense of purpose. Every job followed one after the other with practiced ease, giving little time for doubt or thought. Days went by without any signs. There were no calendars on the walls, no holidays celebrated, and no milestones marked. People only measured time by changes in their bodies, planted and picked crops. Winters came and went. The sisters got older, but it didn't matter. It felt like aging was happening in an abstract way, not in a way that moved forward. Their mother didn't have to keep a close eye on them anymore. The sisters stayed within the limits they were supposed to, without being told to. They didn't test limits because the idea of testing didn't make sense anymore. The outside world was just a vague idea with no details or importance. There was even less social interaction outside of the home. Their mother took care of the exchange by herself whenever she could when they needed supplies. When one of the sisters was with her, they were quiet and kept their eyes down, taking in little more than what she said at the time. These brief encounters reinforced their discomfort rather than easing it. Within the house, communication became increasingly economical. Words were used sparingly, only when necessary to complete a task. Emotional expression found no outlet. Disagreement never surfaced. Harmony was maintained not through understanding, but through the absence of alternatives. The sisters developed an intense reliance on predictability. Any disruption, however minor, produced visible distress, a delayed meal, and an unexpected noise. A change in weather patterns, each. Deviation unsettled them in ways they struggled to articulate. Their identities, once forming, now stabilized around repetition. They were not encouraged to imagine different futures. They did not consider leaving. The land was not experienced as a place among others, but as the only place that existed. From the outside, this arrangement appeared stable. The sisters caused no trouble. They worked diligently. They remained polite when encountered. There was no obvious sign of dysfunction, only an absence of engagement that drew little attention. Internally, however, something essential had narrowed. Without exposure to choice, choice itself became overwhelming to contemplate. Without variation, adaptability weakened. The world beyond the property line grew increasingly unreal, while the routines within the house gained absolute authority. As the 1930s drew to a close, the sisters stood firmly in adulthood, yet unprepared for anything beyond what they had always known. Their lives had settled into a pattern so complete that it no longer felt restrictive. It felt inevitable. Isolation had ceased to be a condition. It had become a state of being unseen by those who passed nearby. The foundation for future collapse was already in place, built not through force or cruelty, but through years of quiet repetition and unchallenged fear. While the sisters remained fixed within the boundaries of their land, the world beyond it entered a period of rapid transformation. News of conflict spread across the country, carried by newspapers, radios, and conversations in public spaces. Men left towns for military service. Factories expanded. Communities adjusted to shortages, rationing, and uncertainty. None of this entered the sisters' daily lives. The house continued to operate according to the same routines it always had. Mornings began with work. Evenings ended in silence. There were no announcements, no disruptions that acknowledged the wider events unfolding elsewhere. The land absorbed their attention completely, insulating them from history as it occurred. Their mother remained, steadfast in her avoidance of outside influence. She did not bring a radio into the house. She did not discuss national events. When neighbors spoke of changes or losses, she redirected the conversation toward practical matters and ended it quickly. The world beyond the property line, already abstract, became increasingly irrelevant by design. The sisters sensed change only indirectly. Fewer people passed along the road. Deliveries became less frequent. Supplies were managed more carefully. These shifts registered as inconveniences rather than indicators of broader upheaval. Without context, the significance of these changes could not be understood. As years passed, the contrast between the static nature of the household and the evolving society beyond it grew more pronounced. While others adapted, the sisters remained anchored to a structure that did not allow adaptation. Skills that might have helped them navigate change were never developed. Flexibility, negotiation, and decision-making were unnecessary within a world that never demanded them. The sisters grew older in appearance, but not in orientation. They did not mark milestones or transitions. There was no sense of participating in a shared national experience. The war came and went without altering their internal reality. This absence of connection had consequences that went unnoticed at the time. The longer the sisters remained detached from the world's rhythms, the more foreign those rhythms became. Change itself began to feel threatening, even when it did not directly affect them. Their mother interpreted the household's stability as validation. The chaos she feared had not breached the perimeter she had established. From her perspective, the system had succeeded. What she did not recognize was how deeply that system depended on her presence and authority. The order she maintained was not self-correcting. It required constant reinforcement, even as her own strength slowly declined. As the 1940s progressed, subtle signs of strain emerged. The mother tired more easily. Tasks once completed effortlessly now took longer. The sisters compensated without question, assuming additional responsibilities as needed. Still, nothing fundamentally changed. The world outside continued to move forward, leaving the house further behind with each passing year. The sisters did not feel left behind. They had no concept of comparison. They simply existed within the only framework they had ever known. This widening gap between isolation and society went unrest, quietly setting the stage for a future moment when the separation could no longer be maintained. As the years advanced, the physical presence that had sustained the household's rigid order began to weaken. The mother, once tireless in her vigilance, showed signs of age that could no longer be concealed by routine alone. Her movement slowed, her endurance diminished, yet her authority did not soften. If anything, it became more concentrated. She spent more time seated, observing rather than participating, but her expectations remained unchanged. Instructions were delivered with the same certainty, even as her ability to carry them out declined. The sisters responded by filling the gaps instinctively, stepping into tasks without being asked, ensuring that the rhythms of the household remained uninterrupted. No discussion took place about what would happen when the mother could no longer direct their lives. The subject did not exist within the structure she had built. The future, as a concept, remained unspoken. Warnings grew more repetitive, returning again and again to the dangers of the outside world. These reminders were no longer necessary, but she continued them nonetheless, as if repetition itself could extend control. The sisters listened attentively, absorbing the familiar language without question. They had learned long ago that stability depended on compliance. As her health declined, the house became quieter. The mother spoke less, conserving energy, but when she did speak, her words carried heightened weight. She reminded the sisters of the importance of staying together, of maintaining the land, of avoiding interference from outsiders. These instructions functioned as both guidance and legacy. The sisters, now fully responsible for the household's daily operation, experienced a growing tension they could not articulate. They sensed change, but lacked the tools to interpret it. Without precedent, they did not recognize the gradual erosion of the system they relied upon. Care flowed in one direction. They attended to their mother's needs with diligence, yet remained emotionally dependent on her presence, even as they assumed practical authority, psychological authority, remained firmly with her. The imbalance went unnoticed because it had always existed. As illness confined the mother increasingly to her bed, the sisters' world narrowed further. Their contact with neighbors diminished. Supply trips became less frequent. The land, once sufficient, now demanded more effort than before. Still, the rules held. The mother's fear of the outside world did not diminish with age. It intensified, sharpened by the awareness that her influence would not last indefinitely. She spoke of safety not as a condition, but as a responsibility the sisters would inherit. They accepted this responsibility without hesitation, unaware that it was not protection being passed down, but confinement. By the end of this period, the household functioned on momentum alone. The structure remained intact, but its foundation depended entirely on a presence that was fading. What neither the mother nor the sisters could acknowledge was that the system had never been designed to survive without her, and once she was gone, nothing within the house would guide them forward. The mother died during the winter, quietly and without ceremony. Her passing did not arrive with drama or final words. It occurred in the same room where she had spent her final years, surrounded by the familiar stillness of the house she had ruled for decades. For the sisters, her death did not register as an ending. It felt more like an interruption. They remained where they were, continuing their routines out of instinct rather than intention. Meals were prepared at the usual times. The fire was tended. The house was cleaned. The body remained in the bed, covered, untouched, except for basic care, because neither sister knew what was expected of them next. They had never witnessed death before. They had never attended a funeral. They did not understand the procedures that followed. A passing. Without instruction, they waited. Hours turned into days. The silence deepened, no longer structured by their mother's voice. The absence of her authority created a void rather than freedom. The sisters did not discuss what to do. They did not argue. They simply continued existing within the framework that had always guided them, even though its source was gone. Eventually, physical necessity forced a decision. The cold preserved the body for a time, but the sisters sensed that something was wrong. Their uncertainty grew into anxiety, then into fear. The structure they relied on had failed to provide direction. For the first time in their lives, they faced a situation that routine could not resolve. After several days, one of the sisters approached a neighboring property. It was the first time either of them had done so alone. The journey was short, but it felt disorienting. Every step carried hesitation. Speech, when it came, was halting and unclear. The neighbor recognized immediately that something was amiss. Authorities were contacted. The house was entered by people. The sisters did not know. Questions were asked that they could not answer clearly. Dates, names, and explanations were missing or incomplete. The sisters stood apart, watching as the private space of their lives was examined and assessed. The mother's death was recorded. Arrangements were made. The process unfolded around the sisters rather than with them. During this period, it became apparent that the sisters lacked basic knowledge expected of adults. They struggled to understand instructions. They reacted poorly to unfamiliar environments. Their distress was visible, though difficult for them to express verbally. The death that should have marked a transition instead exposed a profound vulnerability. When the burial was completed, the sisters returned to the house, but nothing felt stable. The authority that had governed their lives was gone, and no alternative structure existed to replace it. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. They did not experience grief in conventional terms. Their response was closer to disorientation. The presence that had defined reality itself was absent, leaving them without reference. It was at this point that the outside world could no longer overlook their situation. What had once appeared as harmless privacy now revealed itself as prolonged isolation with lasting consequences. The sisters stood at the edge of a world they did not understand, unprepared to step forward, yet unable to retreat. The moment that had been postponed for. Decades had arrived, not as liberation, but as exposure. The departure from the house did not feel like a choice. It unfolded as a sequence of instructions given by unfamiliar voices spoken with efficiency rather than cruelty. The sisters followed because they had always followed. Resistance did not occur to them. Confusion did. The town of Clearfield appeared overwhelming from the moment they entered it. The scale alone disrupted their sense of proportion. Buildings stood too close together. Sounds overlapped without. Pause. People moved with urgency that felt chaotic rather than purposeful. The sisters walked closely side by side, mirroring each other in posture and pace. Their eyes remained fixed ahead or lowered toward the ground. They did not initiate conversation. When spoken to, they responded slowly, choosing words with visible effort. Officials attempted to gather basic information. Names were confirmed. Ages were estimated rather than known. Dates could not be provided with certainty. Questions about. Education and employment produced silence or confusion. It became clear that the sisters did not understand the expectations placed upon them. Simple procedures required repeated explanation. Directions needed to be broken into single steps. Even then, hesitation persisted. The experience triggered visible distress. Their breathing became shallow. Their hands trembled when separated, even briefly. When asked to wait alone, they showed signs of panic that surprised those observing them. What had initially appeared to be grief now revealed itself as something deeper. The sisters were not merely mourning their mother. They were confronting a world that demanded skills they had never been allowed to develop. Local authorities documented their condition carefully. There was no evidence of abuse in the conventional sense, no signs of physical harm. The house had been clean. Food had been sufficient. The sisters had not been restrained. Yet the absence of harm did not equate to the presence of readiness. The sisters were returned to the house temporarily under supervision. The land that had once represented safety now felt unstable. Without their mother, the routines lost coherence. Tasks were completed, but without purpose. Interactions with officials increased. Each visit reinforced the same conclusion. The sisters could not manage basic affairs independently. They did not understand money. They could not navigate social exchange. They reacted poorly to change and unpredictability. What had been invisible for decades now stood plainly exposed. The town adjusted its perception accordingly. What was once regarded as privacy was now understood as prolonged isolation. Concern replaced curiosity. Responsibility replaced distance. For the sisters, this shift was incomprehensible. They did not grasp why attention had arrived so suddenly. The outside world had entered their lives not gradually but all at once, and they were not prepared to meet it. The attempts to assist the sisters began with cautious optimism. Officials believed that with guidance and patience, the transition into ordinary life might be possible. They were placed under temporary supervision and introduced gradually to basic structures that most adults navigated without thought. The effort proved far more difficult than anticipated. Simple tasks exposed deep limitations. Handling money caused visible anxiety. The concept of exchange confused them. Numbers held no practical meaning beyond counting objects. Written forms overwhelmed them completely. Instructions had to be repeated multiple times, often without result. Social interaction presented even greater challenges. The sisters struggled to interpret tone and intention. They answered questions literally and hesitantly. Silence returned whenever uncertainty arose. In unfamiliar settings, their distress escalated quickly, leading to withdrawal or immobility. Attempts to separate them, even briefly, resulted in acute agitation. Their reliance on each other had become absolute. Without proximity, they appeared disoriented. unable to focus on tasks or respond coherently. Professionals observed that the sisters were not defiant or resistant. They were overwhelmed. The expectations of the outside world demanded cognitive and emotional flexibility they did not possess. Adaptation required skills that had never been practiced. Living arrangements were adjusted repeatedly in search of improvement. Each adjustment produced the same outcome. Anxiety increased. Function decreased. Familiarity remained the only. Stabilizing force. The conclusion emerged slowly and reluctantly. Prolonged isolation during critical developmental years had impaired their ability to operate independently. This impairment was not temporary. It was structural. The sisters were evaluated further, and the findings remained consistent. They could perform repetitive tasks within controlled environments. They could not navigate unpredictability. Decision-making caused paralysis. Change produced fear rather than curiosity. The idea of full independence was quietly set aside. Care providers shifted their focus from integration to accommodation. Safety replaced progress as the primary objective. The sisters were not encouraged to push boundaries. Boundaries were reintroduced, this time as support rather than restriction. For the first time, the structure of their lives was acknowledged as something that could not simply be dismantled without consequence. What had once been imposed by fear was now replicated out of necessity. The sisters did not understand the assessments or conclusions reached about them. They only realized that things were moving more slowly and that their hopes had faded. They seemed calmer in this smaller space. The world had tried to meet them in the middle. It had found out how far away they really were. The choice to sell the property was made quietly and without fanfare. There was no argument and no pushback. The land that had once been the center of the sisters' lives was now empty of power and purpose. It was taken care of legally, by other people. The sisters were only told things that were important to them. They didn't say anything. They didn't ask any questions. When the house was opened for inventory, the things inside showed that life had stayed mostly the same for decades. The furniture looked like it had been carefully cared for instead of being replaced. Instead of being thrown away, tools had been fixed over and over again. Clothes were worn but neat, and they followed the same patterns year after year. People found calendars still hanging on the walls. Dates stayed marked long after their importance. Pages had not been flipped. Time had never been officially recognized before, only through routine. There weren't many books, and most of them were not read. The margins were clean. There were no signs that the pages had been used more than once. There were very few written records of any kind. The lack of documentation spoke louder than any documentation ever could have. In the kitchen, the supplies showed that people liked what they were used to. The ingredients were simple, and the amounts were exact. There was nothing that suggested trying something new or making a change. The house had. Not a place to grow, but to keep things safe. Outside, the land showed similar signs. Instead of being rebuilt, the fences had been fixed. Pathways followed the same roads that had been worn down by years of use. Nothing went out. Everything bent back toward the house. The people who were supposed to clear the property noticed that there were no personal items. There were no letters from friends, only a few formal pictures and nothing that showed that the person was involved in the world outside of their own. The house had worked as a closed system. The building was taken down after the sale was final. The materials were used for something else. The land was ready for new owners. The sisters' long imprisonment left behind physical evidence that slowly disappeared. There were only records and memories left, as well as notes made after the fact. Impressions that were gathered too late to change the outcome. The sisters weren't there when the house was taken apart. They didn't see it being taken away. For them, the place that had once held. Nothing existed anymore. They didn't want to come back. Without any ceremony, the world moved on and took back the space. The house that had been there for decades disappeared without a sound, leaving behind only questions about what had been allowed to stay hidden for so long. The sisters lived in a care facility in the same state for the rest of their lives. The environment was organized and predictable, with the goal of lowering stress rather than promoting independence. Days went by slowly, beat. Food came on time. The rooms stayed the same. Expectations were low and well-defined. The sisters seemed calm as long as they stayed within these limits. They did the simple tasks that were given to them. They walked together when they could. They didn't talk much, and when they did, they were always careful. Staff said they didn't need much supervision as long as routines were followed. Disruption was still the only thing that reliably made people anxious. This time, the outside world was far away on purpose, not by accident. Fear. Windows moved, but they didn't ask people to join in. People came and went without making lasting connections. The sisters didn't ask about things that happened outside of the facility. They didn't show any interest in lives that were different from theirs. There was safety again, but it came at a price. People who worked with them knew that their condition would last. The sisters were not going back. They were steady. Things that had been lost could not be found again because they had never existed. The ability to. They still had the choice. It had never been able to grow. The sisters sat next to each other in silence, as they always did. Their closeness was still the main thing that guided them. They had a hard time functioning on their own. They found a balance together, even though it was small. There was no effort to bring back the idea of independence. It didn't do anything. Ambition was replaced by comfort. Preservation took the place of possibility. There were no public records of either protest or reflection. The sisters didn't say anything about their past. They didn't talk about memories of the land or the house. Most of what they knew about their past came from what other people said, not from their own stories. When one sister died years later, the other sister looked confused but didn't seem to be very sad. Staff responded by adding more structure and comfort. The other sister slowly adjusted, her world getting smaller but still whole. The story didn't end with getting away or changing. It ended with being contained. What stands out in retrospect is not the lack of cruelty, but the lack of intervention. For years, the sisters lived in plain sight, and people thought they were alone when they were really just private. They thought they were simple when they were really dependent. Freedom finally came, but they didn't have the skills to get it. The world kept the sisters safe until it became impossible to reach. There was no longer a way to move forward when the doors opened. Only a safe place to stay. Their lives remind us that being locked up does not always look like force. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as care, fueled by fear, and accepted as a matter of course. And when that confinement lasts long enough, freedom no longer feels like freedom. It feels like being lost. In the end, the sisters were fine. They also got their freedom way too late.